and wherever people gathered to hear the Lord's word preached. It didn't really matter. I gathered folks together wherever I went, even in between charges or appointments, between gold mining camps. And I found across the 40 years or so of my preaching ministry in Colorado that people generally were welcoming to hear the gospel preached. Now, not everybody was. I remember one time when I was holding a prayer meeting after a camp meeting, preaching service, and we had some folks up at the altar trying to pray through to victory in their life. And one of my partners in that meeting came up and grabbed me by the shoulders as I was praying with someone and said, "Father John, there's somebody back over there who's destroying the benches that we created for people to sit on during our meetings. You need to go and try to solve this problem." So I looked back across the back of the audience, and sure enough, there was a fellow over there under a tree who was crowing like a rooster. Cock-a-doodle-doo! Cock-a-doodle-doo! Well, it was evening time, so I picked up a candle and started walking toward him with the candle raised above my shoulder height. He saw me coming, and he took off up a hollow. As I caught up to him, he wheeled around, and he hit me on my left shoulder, and the candle went flying. And you know, sometimes in life when something happens and you just have this automatic response that you can't control. Well, I had one of those responses at that moment, and I hauled off and hit him. Not a very preachly thing to do. And I will confess I'd never done it before, and thank God I never did it again. But I did it then. Well, you'd thought I had murdered him. He got up and he went to the magistrate and he filed a charge against me, a complaint, said that I had abused him. Well, we had to go and appear before the magistrate and make our case. And I had some friends there who had seen the whole thing, and they testified in my behalf, and the magistrate said, "Well, it sounds like this fellow got exactly what he deserved and that you were the one to give it to him." And that was the end of that. But normally we didn't have much disturbances in our preaching meetings wherever we went, and I was thankful for that. Well, all those stories relate to the first period of my life, what I call the pioneering years. But after my son Elias was murdered in Granite, I entered into the phase of my life that I came to call the anguishing and aging years. Elias was murdered on July 3rd, 1874. And as I said before, it just crushed my spirit. I kept soldiering on, going to my preaching appointments, doing the best that I could. But after 2 years of trying that, my heart just wasn't in the ministry and preaching any longer. And so at the annual conference of 1876, I asked to be placed on superannuated status. I think actually supernumerated status. Now, both of those terms relate to the relationship between preachers and the Methodist conference. Methodist preachers have a relationship with a conference, and that relationship takes several different forms over the years. So if you are ordained and actively preaching, you are in an effective relationship with the conference, which means you are effective and available for full-time appointment to preach. I didn't feel effective any longer, so I took supernumerary status, which meant it was a leave of absence. I was physically healthy, but as I say, my spirit was crushed. And so I quit. And this introduces a theme that became central to my later years in Colorado. There were a number of times in my life where I felt like I'd come to the end of my rope and I was ready to quit. Quit preaching, quit the ministry, and go on to something else. But I kept discovering over and over again that when I came to those moments, God hadn't used me up yet. And so I learned, and it was a hard time coming, but I learned never quit until God has used you up. I mean, when I first came out to Colorado in 1859, I thought I was ready to quit ministry then. And the reason was because I was having some kind of trouble with my eyes, some kind of eye ailment, that had convinced me that I was losing my vision. And I wanted to come to Colorado then because I wanted to see Pikes Peak Region before I went blind. And I'd never heard of a blind circuit-riding Methodist preacher before, and I had no intention of becoming the first one. So I thought I was quit. But I found out here God wasn't done with me yet. After my son Elias died, I thought I was quit again. And after 2 years of meandering rather aimlessly, trying to cobble together a living, because in those days the Methodists had no support for superannuated or superannuated preachers, we were on our own. But after 2 years, I went back to the next conference and asked to be replaced back on effective relationship available for full-time appointment. By this time, I was 73 years old, and the conference appointed me to Summit County Breckenridge charge. Now, in that day, Summit County had not yet been divided up into the 4 counties that took its place and exist today. It was a huge geographical area, and I was put in charge of the entire area of Summit County with no assistant and no missionary support for my salary. Frankly, I felt like the conference had hung me out to dry. But I went. I said, I'll give this 1 year. It was a very difficult year, I will confess. But I did accomplish some things in that year in Breckenridge. Foremost was the building of the first church building on the western slope. Breckenridge didn't have a church to meet in, a church building to meet in, but the town was an active gold mining town, and the population had swelled again, and the opportunity was right to build a church building. Now, I had bought a lot when I first came to Breckenridge, upon which I was going to build a parsonage, which I did, and I kept looking for a suitable site in town for a church building, but couldn't find one. So I deeded part of my property to the church for $1, and we built that first church building on the western slope. I left 35 members in Breckenridge after that first year, and at the end of it, at the age of 74 by that time, I decided it was time to quit again. So I quit, and Lucinda and I moved to our dairy farm, our ranch, near Castle Rock. And I puttered around there for another 2 years and decided, you know what? Cattle farming, dairy farming, cattle ranching was not for me. I was either too lazy or too unskilled to do it successfully. So I gave the cattle to one of my sons who had also moved and bought property adjacent to my ranch near Castle Rock. And I was called back to preach again. In 1885, I was appointed or elected the chaplain of the fairly new state senate in Colorado. It wasn't a very well-paying job. It was more honorary than remunerary. But I accepted it with the honor that came with it. And shortly thereafter, Lucinda and I made a return visit to Breckenridge, where we discovered that the conference had not been able to send anyone to serve the Breckenridge pulpit. So I offered to fill it until they could find someone to send. I didn't have any intention that it would take the conference 2 years to find a replacement to send. So Lucinda and I spent 2 more years in Breckenridge. And they were nearly as hard as the first year that we had spent there. So after 2 years, we decided to hang up our spurs again, that I was ready to quit. Now, shortly thereafter, I discovered a gold mine up near the summit of Boreas Pass. I called it the Warrior's Mark Mine. And Lucinda and I built a log cabin near the mine. And, of course, mine workers came and built cabins to live there. And I named the place Dyersville. And it was a lovely spot. But 2 years at 14,000 feet convinced us we were getting too old to spend winters at that elevation. So we quit the gold mine and moved to a home that we had purchased in University Park in Denver. It was one of the first homes built in that area, right around the campus of Denver University, or Denver Seminary, as we called it in the early days, founded by the Methodists to train Methodist preachers in the Western territories. And it grew and developed into a great university. Unfortunately, about 5 days after we moved from Breckenridge to our home in University Park, my beloved Lucinda died. Just up and died. And once again, I was left alone and bereft and grief-stricken. And I quit. But God hadn't used me up yet. So I found myself back in Breckenridge, and now nearing the age of 80, I took on again the full responsibilities of preaching and going to the mining camps around Breckenridge and being in full-time ministry. Well, as time wore on, now I'm into my mid and late 80s, I finally left Breckenridge, not for the last time, but for the last time as their full-time preacher. And one day I was traveling in South Park when the carriage I was riding in, the horses bolted, and I was thrown from the carriage and hurt very badly. By this time, I had regained a lot of weight that I had lost on my walk out to Colorado and during my years of walking around to the mining camps and preaching in them. So I was mid-80s and overweight and not in great shape, and so this fall hurt me quite a bit. In fact, for a while, they were concerned about my survival. And the only conference that I missed in all the time that I was preaching in Colorado was the conference of 1894. I'm sorry, 1890. Yes, it was 1894. And at that conference, my brothers in the Methodist clergy passed this resolution. Whereas it has been reported to this conference that our venerable father in Christ, Reverend J.L. Dyer, that's me, has received a serious accident which we fear will permanently disable him and deprive us of future fellowship with him in the recurring sessions of the Colorado Annual Conference. Therefore, be it resolved that we assure Father Dyer of our heartfelt sympathy and prayers. We assure him that at this session his vacant place is felt by his brethren. At future sessions his memory will be a cherished inspiration. And when at last our beloved snowshoe itinerant has passed up the mountain path into the gates of pearl, we who remain will rejoice in his life and try so to live as to tell him when we meet in heaven that his faithful pioneer labors in Colorado have not been in vain in the Lord. Does that sound to you like they weren't expecting me to come back to conference ever again? That they'd given up on me? They were expecting me to die almost any moment? That's the way it sounded to me. But I came to 7 more annual conferences. Because the Lord hadn't used me up yet. At the age of 87, I died at 89, I went back to Breckenridge once again. And it's kind of funny. The local paper there wrote an article about my being there. Let me find it. Here it is. The newspaper reported, Reverend Father Dyer made one of his itinerant preaching tours during the week to some of the mining towns. The Reverend gentleman bears his many years well in spite of the accident a few years ago which compels him to get around on crutches. He has known and visited Breckenridge for 37 years. He left here on Tuesday for Kokomo. Dr. Cranston, presiding elder of the Southern District, met the old man on a dusty road in South Park, hobbling along on his crutches. "Why, Brother Dyer," Dr. Cranston inquired, "what are you doing here?" And Father Dyer answered, leaning on his crutches, "I thought there might be some people over here who needed preaching." That defines my life. I fought the call to preach, but when I finally answered, that became my life mission and my life purpose, and I never backed away from it Although, as you've heard, there were many times when I felt ready to quit. But the Lord hadn't used me up yet. I preached my last Sunday in October of 1900, it was, at the Cameron Memorial Methodist Church in Denver. Just a few months prior to that, I had attended what was going to be my last annual conference at the Methodist Church in Salida, built on a site that I used to walk across when nothing was there at all. So 1900 in Salida was my last annual conference, and my last sermon was that October at Cameron Memorial Church in Denver. And on my way out from University Park to the outskirts of Denver to Cameron Memorial Church, it was a blustery, cold October day, and I caught a bad cold. And things went from better to worse, and I never quite recovered from that cold. Just kept declining, especially as the spring of 1901 came about. And I finally died on June 16th, 1901. God had finally used me up. And I am so grateful that he did.